Picture a place where all human knowledge was gathered under one roof, where history's greatest minds walked the same halls, debated the same questions, and pursued mysteries that fascinate us to this day. Now imagine this place was completely destroyed, taking with it discoveries that could have advanced civilization by 1,000 years. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building filled with scrolls. It was the beating heart of an intellectual revolution that lasted nearly a millennium, and its destruction remains one of history's greatest tragedies. Today, you'll discover not only how this wonder of the ancient world rose to power, but the real reasons behind its fall. Revelations that go far beyond the simplified stories you've heard before. If you're not already part of our community that values deep historical knowledge, subscribe now. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories that connect past and present in unique ways. To understand what the Library of Alexandria truly meant, we need to travel back to the 4th century BC. The known world was a patchwork of warring civilizations, each jealously guarding its secrets, traditions, and knowledge. Against this backdrop of intellectual fragmentation, a revolutionary vision emerged, gathering all human knowledge in one place. This wasn't just about creating another library. The goal was to build a research center that transcended cultural and religious boundaries, where Persians could debate Greeks, Egyptian mathematicians could work alongside Babylonian philosophers, and human curiosity was the only requirement for entry. Alexandria wasn't just another port city in the Nile Delta. It was conceived as antiquity's equivalent of New York, a crossroads between three continents where African caravans met Mediterranean merchant ships and Asian trading expeditions. But the Ptolemies, Alexander the Great's successors in Egypt, had grander ambitions than trade. They wanted to make their capital the intellectual center of the civilized world. For this, they created not just a library, but an entire academic complex called the Mouseion, literally, the sanctuary of the Muses. Here, the era's greatest thinkers were invited to live, research, and teach with all expenses paid by the state. What made Alexandria unique wasn't just the number of scrolls it housed, but the revolutionary methodology that developed there. For the first time in human history, knowledge was being systematically collected, cataloged, compared, and questioned. Alexandrian librarians weren't mere bookkeepers. They were intellectual detectives who tracked down different versions of ancient texts, identified contradictions, created careful translations, and most importantly, encouraged new knowledge based on evidence and experimentation. This is the story of how humanity almost reached an intellectual golden age 2,000 years before the Renaissance, and how political, religious, and social forces conspired to destroy that dream. The Library of Alexandria's story begins with an obsession, and that obsession belonged to Alexander the Great. When this young Macedonian conquered Egypt in 332 BC, he wasn't simply expanding his empire. He was pursuing a dream planted by his tutor, Aristotle, who had taught him that true power lay not just in military might, but in mastering knowledge itself. Alexander personally chose Alexandria's location where the Nile Delta meets the Mediterranean. He walked the empty beaches, pointing out where ports, palaces, temples would stand, and most importantly, where the world center of knowledge would rise. But Alexander died too young to see his vision realized. It fell to his successors, the Ptolemies, to turn that dream into reality. Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's closest generals, understood that ruling Egypt required more than military force. It demanded intellectual legitimacy and the respect of educated elites throughout the Mediterranean world. Thus began antiquity's most ambitious project, creating a research center that would house not only every existing book, but also the greatest minds of the age. The Mouseion wasn't just a library, it was history's first research university, offering the brightest scholars something unprecedented: complete freedom to research, experiment, and question without financial worries or political pressure. The Ptolemies grasped something many modern rulers still struggle with: investing in knowledge is the most profitable investment a state can make. The library's construction lasted decades and consumed resources equivalent to small nations' military budgets. Architects created endless corridors of bookshelves, reading rooms with optimized natural lighting, workshops for scribes, laboratories for experiments, astronomical observatories, botanical gardens for medical research, and even a zoo for anatomical studies. Most impressive was the cataloging system, an innovation unmatched until the modern era. Each scroll received a label with information about author, origin, content, and location, allowing researchers to quickly find specific information among hundreds of thousands of documents. The Ptolemies' methods for acquiring books reveal both their dedication and their ruthlessness when it came to knowledge. They established laws requiring all ships entering Alexandria's harbor to surrender their libraries for inspection. Any valuable or rare book was immediately confiscated, copied by professional scribes, and then, in theory, returned to the owner. In practice, owners often received the copy while the original stayed in Alexandria's archives. Even more controversial was their program of forced loans. Ptolemaic agents traveled the Mediterranean offering enormous sums for entire temple libraries, philosophical schools, and private collections. When money didn't work, those same agents sometimes returned with less diplomatic methods. The library's intellectual core comprised an extraordinary community representing the pinnacle of human knowledge in every field. Euclid developed the fundamentals of geometry still taught today, spending years organizing mathematical discoveries scattered across centuries. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference with stunning accuracy and created the first mathematical world map, founding scientific geography. Aristarchus of Samos first proposed that Earth revolved around the Sun, an idea so revolutionary it was rejected and forgotten for nearly 2,000 years until Copernicus rediscovered it. Perhaps the greatest genius to walk the library's halls was Archimedes of Syracuse. Though he didn't live permanently in Alexandria, he maintained constant correspondence with its mathematicians and regularly visited. Archimedes wasn't just a theorist. He was a practical inventor who understood that knowledge's true value lay in solving real problems. He developed war machines that defended his hometown against Rome for years, created pulley and lever systems that moved enormous loads with minimal effort, and discovered physics principles that still bear his name. The library also became the world's medical center, attracting physicians from across the Roman Empire and beyond. Herophilus of Chalcedon revolutionized human anatomy by systematically dissecting human bodies, distinguishing between sensory and motor nerves, identifying brain functions, and establishing that the heart, not the brain, was the circulatory system center. What made these advances possible was Alexandria's unique atmosphere, where different medical traditions, Egyptian, Greek, Persian, Indian, could be compared and synthesized without the cultural biases dominating other regions. The library's cultural impact extended far beyond exact sciences. Alexandrian scholars created the first critical editions of Homer's poems, establishing definitive texts that influenced all later Western literature. They first translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, creating the famous Septuagint that became early Christianity's sacred text. Callimachus developed history's first bibliographic cataloging system, the Pinox, which organized books by subject and author while including writer biographies and work summaries, effectively creating the first world encyclopedia. Alexandria's intellectual atmosphere was unique because it combined scientific rigor with cultural openness. Jewish scholars worked alongside Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers debated Babylonian mathematicians, and Persian physicians collaborated with Alexandrian anatomists. This diversity wasn't just tolerated, it was actively promoted by Ptolemies, who understood that innovation arises from encounters between different perspectives and traditions. The library's influence spread throughout the known world through networks of corresponding scholars and branch institutions. Cities like Pergamum tried creating competing libraries. Rhodes, Athens, and even Rome sent their brightest young men to study in Alexandria, many returning to found schools and libraries in their homelands, spreading Alexandrian methods across the Mediterranean. But even at its glory's height, cracks were appearing that would eventually lead to the library's fall. Maintaining this colossal institution cost astronomical sums, requiring significant portions of the Ptolemaic kingdom's budget. As Egypt faced increasing military pressure from Rome and internal revolts, resources allocated to the library began dwindling. Additionally, Alexandria's cosmopolitan nature, once its greatest strength, began generating social and religious tensions the early Ptolemies had managed to control. The Library of Alexandria's end didn't come as sudden catastrophe, but as slow erosion beginning in the 2nd century BC, when external pressures on Ptolemaic Egypt became unbearable. Rome, which had initially respected and admired the Alexandrian intellectual tradition, began seeing the Ptolemaic kingdom not as a cultural ally but as a political obstacle requiring control. The civil war between Cleopatra VII and her brother Ptolemy XIII marked the moment Alexandria transformed from a sanctuary of knowledge into a pawn in Rome's power games. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, pursuing Pompey in civil war, he wasn't interested in the library's intellectual treasures but in Egypt's literal treasures. The fire that destroyed part of the library during fighting in Alexandria's harbor was merely collateral damage from military operations prioritizing political objectives over cultural preservation. Caesar later tried minimizing the damage, claiming only papyrus deposits meant for export had burned. But contemporary scholars reported losses of tens of thousands of unique volumes, including original texts by Greek playwrights whose works we now know only as fragments. What makes this first destruction particularly tragic is that it was completely avoidable. Caesar had more than enough resources to protect the library during the siege, but simply didn't consider its preservation strategically important. This reflected a fundamental shift in Roman mentality. While early Roman Alexandrian contacts had been marked by mutual admiration, Roman generals sent their sons to study at the Mausoleum. Romans now saw Greek knowledge as decadent curiosity, less important than Roman military and administrative efficiency. Cleopatra VII, the last great defender of the Alexandrian tradition, desperately tried restoring the library to former glory. She personally funded expeditions to recover lost texts, established new scholarships to lure scholars back to Alexandria, and even seduced first Caesar, then Mark Antony, partly hoping Roman power could protect her kingdom's intellectual legacy. Cleopatra wasn't just the seductive queen of Hollywood movies. She was a genuine intellectual who spoke 9 languages, studied mathematics, philosophy, and rhetoric, and understood that her kingdom's political survival depended on remaining culturally relevant. But the library Cleopatra tried to save was no longer the glorious institution of the early Ptolemies. Decades of political instability had forced many of the best scholars to seek patronage elsewhere. Pergamum, Rhodes, and even Rome began offering more attractive conditions for researchers, fragmenting the intellectual community that had been Alexandria's beating heart. Worse, knowledge itself was changing. The era of great individual discoveries was giving way to an age of compilation and commentary, where scholars were content explaining and preserving predecessors' work rather than expanding human knowledge's frontiers. When Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BC, he wasn't just conquering Egypt. He was ending the last era of Alexandrian intellectual independence. The new emperor, soon to become Augustus, held utilitarian views of knowledge. Everything should serve Roman state interests. He kept the library running but transformed it from a free research center into an imperial propaganda institution, where scholars were expected to produce works glorifying Rome and justifying its Mediterranean dominance. Under Roman rule, Alexandria retained its status as a learning center but lost its revolutionary soul. New Roman administrators neither understood nor cared about Alexandrian methodology of questioning established authorities and seeking truth through experimentation. They preferred scholars who compiled and organized existing knowledge, creating practical manuals for imperial administration. Paradoxically, during this period of intellectual decline, some of the library's most important discoveries finally began spreading worldwide. Romans, though not innovative, were excellent knowledge propagators. Alexandrian texts were copied and distributed throughout the empire, reaching libraries in Constantinople, Cordoba, Baghdad, and even Irish monasteries. The most devastating blow came not from external invaders but from internal changes in Alexandrian society itself. Christianity, initially just one of many religious sects flourishing in cosmopolitan Alexandria, began gaining significant political influence during the 3rd century AD. Early Alexandrian Christians like Clement and Origen had been genuine scholars who saw classical knowledge as compatible with Christian faith. They used Alexandrian textual analysis methods to study scriptures, and their allegorical biblical interpretations showed clear influence from hermeneutics developed by library scholars. But as Christianity became more orthodox and politically powerful, a new generation of Christian leaders began seeing pagan intellectual tradition as threatening faith's purity. Theophilus, who became Patriarch of Alexandria in 385 AD, embodied this new attitude. He wasn't an intellectual interested in synthesizing faith and reason, but a religious fanatic who saw any non-scriptural knowledge as potentially demonic. Under his leadership, Christian mobs began attacking pagan temples, and scholars refusing conversion were persecuted, exiled, or worse. Hypatia's murder in 415 AD represents the symbolic moment when Alexandria definitively lost its status as a world knowledge center. Hypatia wasn't only the last great mathematician of the Alexandrian school, she was the living symbol of the intellectual tradition that had made Alexandria famous. Daughter of mathematician Theon, she'd been educated in the finest Alexandrian methods, mastered geometry, astronomy, and philosophy, and maintained a school teaching both Christians and pagans. Her crime was insisting that seeking truth through reason and observation was compatible with genuine faith. Hypatia's death wasn't random violence but the result of a systematic campaign to eliminate independent intellectuals' influence in Alexandria's political life. Cyril, Theophilus's nephew and successor as patriarch, had orchestrated clashes between Christians and both Jews and pagans, using religion as pretext to consolidate political power. The method chosen for Hypatia's murder reveals the depth of hatred religious fanatics felt for the Alexandrian intellectual tradition. She was dragged from her chariot by Christian monks, taken to a church, stripped naked, and mutilated to death with oyster shells. Her body was dismembered and burned. Her works systematically destroyed. This violence wasn't condemned by Christian authorities but celebrated as faith's victory over pagan superstition. After Hypatia's death, the library entered its final decline. Remaining scholars fell silent, focusing on preserving texts rather than producing new knowledge. The great tradition of public debate and scientific experimentation was replaced by an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship. Many important texts were secretly sent to Constantinople or other cities with some tolerance for secular learning. The Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 AD brought the library's final chapter, but more complexly than usually told. The famous story of Caliph Omar ordering books burned because, if they agree with the Quran, they're unnecessary. If they disagree, they're heretical, is almost certainly later invention. Arab conquerors actually had deep respect for knowledge and actively promoted translating Greek texts into Arabic. What they found in Alexandria, however, was no longer antiquity's great library but fragmentary remains of an institution systematically destroyed over centuries. Arab scholars arriving in Alexandria made heroic efforts to save what remained of the Alexandrian tradition. They established Baghdad's House of Wisdom partly to recreate the intellectual environment that had made Alexandria famous. Mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi, physicians like Al-Razi, and philosophers like Al-Farabi were all direct heirs of the Alexandrian tradition, their works preserving much knowledge that would have been lost forever relying solely on European sources. What ultimately destroyed the Library of Alexandria wasn't a single event but a fundamental change in human attitudes toward knowledge. The disinterested curiosity that motivated Eratosthenes to calculate Earth's circumference was replaced by utilitarian mindsets valuing only information serving specific religious or political purposes. Scientific methodology of forming hypotheses and testing them through observation gave way to reliance on ancient authorities and sacred texts. The tradition of open debate between different cultural perspectives was replaced by rigid orthodoxies punishing questioning. The Library of Alexandria's destruction wasn't just the loss of books and scrolls, it was the murder of a historical possibility that still haunts us with its implications. When we imagine where humanity might be if that tradition of scientific inquiry and intellectual collaboration had continued unbroken, the numbers are literally incalculable. Eratosthenes had calculated Earth's circumference, Aristarchus proposed heliocentrism, Herophilus mapped the human nervous system, and Archimedes developed physics principles not rediscovered until Galileo. If this tradition had survived, humanity might have achieved the scientific revolution not in the 17th century, but in the 3rd century AD. What makes the tragedy even more profound is recognizing that Alexandria represented something our modern civilization still struggles to recreate. A truly international space where intellectual merit was the sole criterion for judgment, where different cultural and religious traditions coexisted and mutually enriched each other, where knowledge was seen as humanity's common good rather than nations' or corporations' private property. The Ptolemies understood something many contemporary rulers still can't accept. Investment in fundamental research, even without immediate benefits, is the most effective way to ensure civilization's long-term prosperity and security. Today, when we debate public science funding, academic freedom, international research collaboration, or tensions between religious orthodoxies and scientific inquiry, we're essentially reliving the same conflicts that destroyed Alexandria. The rise of anti-intellectual movements, cuts to basic research funding, science's politicization, and knowledge's fragmentation into isolated specialties are all contemporary echoes of forces that condemn the library to extinction. The difference is that today we have Alexandria's historical example showing us exactly where these trends can lead. But perhaps Alexandria's most important lesson isn't about bigotries or ignorance's dangers, but about human curiosity's transformative power when nurtured and protected. For nearly 1,000 years, that institution proved it was possible to create a community based on truth's selfless pursuit, where people from different backgrounds could work together to push human knowledge's boundaries. If we could do it once in history, we can do it again, and perhaps this time with wisdom necessary to better protect this legacy from forces that have always conspired against it. The Library of Alexandria didn't die completely in 641, 415, or 48 BC. It lives today in every research laboratory, in every university valuing free inquiry, in every international scientific collaboration, in every moment we choose evidence over prejudice, curiosity over dogmatic certainty, cooperation over destructive competition. Alexandria showed us what humanity can achieve when it decides knowledge is more important than power, truth more valuable than political expediency, and civilization's future depends on our willingness to question, explore, and discover together the universe's mysteries that still await our understanding. If you've made it this far and haven't subscribed yet, Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share in the comments which Alexandria discovery impressed you most.